Hello everyone, it's Fialer here. So I know it's been radio silence on this channel for a little bit. Real life has still been kind of busy for me. I know a lot of you are wondering about the information for Gustav, Michelle, and Liza, and I'll talk a little bit about what's been going on with that at the end of this video. But until then, let's talk about this newest patch that has hit global. Now, even though this is a major patch, because of the way they structure their patches when they come to global, this is actually going to be a pretty small patch. We of course got the standard additions they usually give us, which is the new characters, new 3Cs, and new equipment, and we're getting a new time rift. So without further ado, let's just take a look at these characters real quick. I'm going to try to keep this short and simple. So first we have the Transcender. I still think he looks kind of like Broly, and just like Broly, he's only the villain for a pretty short amount of screen time, and even though he has a lot of backstory that might be interesting, for our heroes he just came off as kind of a really buff speed bump. But anyway, I'm sure that people who watch Apex Arena regularly probably have noticed that Transcendent is not a particularly popular character on the Chinese server, or any other server for that matter. Now personally, I don't think Transcendent is bad. I've played around with him a little bit myself, but it does depend on how you look at it. When you consider that there are so many other characters that are better than him, or just easier to use than him, it just makes it so that it's not very attractive to raise this guy unless you just think he's cool. So this guy is an AoE DPS. He has a collection of pretty strong AoE attacks, and his 3C is a very strange HP swapping skill, which pairs decently well with his AoE skills, as well as his ability to attack twice using normal attacks. He can also gain an HP shield using his 3C, which can sometimes be the difference between winning and not winning, because sometimes these days a lot of matches just come down to trading your units over and over. So a couple flaws with Transcender. First of all, he has pretty low movement. He only has 3 move, and even though his 3C allows him to act again after usage, it needs an enemy target to be used, so it's not like Cold Blood or even something like Kruger's Shield, where you can use it to just extend his range and be able to use him effectively in a rush strategy. It makes him a little bit more suited to tank push, which isn't favored very heavily in this current meta. He also has pretty low intelligence for an offensive mage like him. If you, for example, compare his stats with Kruger's stats or something, his intelligence is a fair bit lower. It's like he has like 40 less intelligence or something like that. He does have a little bit more HP and defense, which makes sense given the way his skills work. But again, that makes him more of a reactive character, or at the very least a more tank push favoring character. Now he does make up for his low intelligence somewhat because he has some AoEs that deal a lot of damage, especially his Disintegrate 2K skill. It's a self-target 5 range AoE that does 0.45 times AoE damage. I think this is like the highest multiplier on any AoE skill they've ever put in the game. But of course that sort of balances out with the fact that he has pretty low intelligence for an offensive unit like himself, and he doesn't have damage in his talent, he just has intelligence, defense, and magic defense boost. Which again, defensive boost to make him more favoring a slower or more tanky playstyle. He also only gets these stacks of his talent when he casts a skill, which means that sometimes it's actually going to be sort of hard to get the 3 stacks that he can get to. He does have Strengthen, and that's pretty much the only way he can consistently stack up his talent, but at least it gives him some self-reliance. He can fit into any box, he can just buff himself or even buff an ally if he needs to. It's always a nice choice, although he doesn't really need that because his factions make it fairly easy to get a buff for the guy. For Mythical, Old Landius is still a pretty common sight. Bolzo and Liko aren't super popular for the Dark Faction buff, but they are around, and they synergize decently well with the Transcender. And of course the Legend always has Landius around. So to summarize again, he's yet another AoE character with a couple debuffs on the side. He has lower move than a lot of the popular debuff mages right now, especially units like Lucretia or Kruger, or even the upcoming SP Lana, who we should be getting in about a month. He trades that off by having a tankier stat spread and a tankier talent, and he even ignores melee penalties and can attack twice. And his double attack is dual phase, so it's not like only offensive or only defensive, you can use it both offensively and defensively. So he's a pretty interesting unit, and certainly not useless, like I said, but the mix of abilities that he has just doesn't play super nicely with the current meta. So now let's talk about Alpha. I think people pretty early on already had her pegged as a pretty gimmicky or narrow character. She is a DPS / off tank, similar to units like Bernhardt or Altmiller. Now, unlike those guys, she can guard magic, but the biggest problem with Alpha is that she lacks a faction buff unlike those two. Even Juggler, who some people might consider just an off tank at this point, or not even a tank at all. But the point is that he can guard both physical and magic as well, and he does have a faction buff, even though it's very hard to fit all of that into the same set. So because Alpha does not offer a faction buff, and her factions are actually sort of narrow in that they're only Dark Faction and Empire Faction, plus in an Empire box it likely should be sort of redundant with Bernhardt, so for the moment Alpha is pretty much completely restricted to only Dark Faction boxes. Now, people who use Dark Faction as their primary faction also have Bernhardt and Ultimiller as an option, and if you really wanted a pure tank to fall back on in your box, it would probably be Albedo. Although, of course, Albedo is a limited character and Alpha is not. But this does show that one of the biggest uphill climbs for Alpha is her redundancy with a lot of the other units that are found in the factions that she's in. She really should have gotten a third faction in my opinion. I think there are a lot of other factions who wouldn't mind having a off-tank unit like Alpha. Even getting past all that, one of the problems with Alpha is that her skill kit is kind of strange and can be difficult to use. A great deal of her kit revolves around this rotating shield that she has. So she has two different shields, one that blocks physical and one that blocks magical damage. She starts the battle with a random one chosen, and then she just switches back and forth between them over and over. Obviously, this can make it kind of difficult to pick ban with her in mind sometimes. If you want to keep her alive, then oftentimes you're going to want to keep one specific type of DPS on your opponent's side. Now, this isn't always a problem because this sort of applies to off-tanks like Bernhardt, Ultimiller, and even Juggler. A lot of times those guys want to ban out all magical DPS if you want them to be tanking. So it's not completely out of the question that you would be able to ban around using Alpha properly. So with all that said, I guess the follow-up question to all that is, why would I use her over Bernhardt, Ultimiller, or even Albedo? Now, the Albedo comparison is a little bit easier to shoot down because Albedo is pretty much a pure tank. Alpha is closer to Bernhardt and Ultimiller in terms of role. She is both a DPS and a tank. So again, one of the appeals of Alpha is that she can guard both physical and magical attacks with her guard skills. And since she does have a revive on her 3C, so even if she gets one shot, it's actually not the end of the world because she can follow up against that, or you can have one of your allies ready to follow up against that. The simple fact that she can guard both physical and magical is a pretty significant difference between her and Bernhardt/Ultimiller. She is also able to more effectively run her main attack, which is her 3C, alongside a guard skill. When you think about how you usually slot in the guard skill for Bernhardt or Ultimiller, you usually can imagine that it's actually very difficult to have them in there and still have them be able to DPS in any meaningful way. So for example, Bernhardt, if he's bringing Strong Arm, he obviously would also be his 3C, so his 1C would probably be Rupture. Bernhardt can still do normal attacks for some decent damage, but he will not have access to his typical DPS attacks, which is usually Sword Dance or sometimes Shield Bash. That is a limitation that Alpha does not have. It's true that Alpha also misses out on an attack skill if she brings her guard instead of like Frontal Assault or something, but her 3C is probably her most important attack, which is an AoE attack. And Ultimiller sort of has a similar issue. If you bring Strong Arm on Ultimiller, his set is just very difficult to have him bring his entire DPS set. You can still fit Raging Thunder or Dragon's Breath into Ultimiller's guard set, but it is kind of difficult to have it work properly. Plus, for the moment, Ultimiller doesn't really have any tanking soldiers other than Phalanx, which is also quite limiting for him. Alpha, on the other hand, has a pretty good selection of soldiers. Currently, she has Crystal Molders, Barbarians, Phalanx, Stone Colossus, and down the line she's also going to be getting some of the really powerful 4th tier soldiers, for example the Ice Peak Lancer and the Desert Mercenaries, both of which are very, very strong troops. So Alpha, I'm not going to say she's not a gimmicky character because I still think she is, and she's very, very narrow in her usage, but I do think she's very much built for specific boxes and she will be very good in those specific boxes. Alright, so before we move on, let's talk a little bit about the availability for these units. First of all, I feel the need to point out that both these units need Epsilon to unlock one of their bonds, and there's quite a few people right now who do not have Epsilon, and Epsilon doesn't even work that well with them in similar boxes, so people who wanted to get Transcendent or Alpha might not necessarily have Epsilon just as a matter of building their boxes, but whatever the case, that is still a point against both of them. If you don't have Epsilon in your barracks, then they're not going to be at their full potential, which is always very annoying. As for whether or not Transcender and Alpha are going to get rerun, if we go by the Chinese server, which of course, as always, I should need to mention that is not guaranteed, there will be a Rosenseal plus Transcender banner sometime in April or so for us. This is a raid-up banner, so but if you really want the Transcender, it's not so bad to pull on this banner when it comes, because Rosen, of course, is always an essential character, whether it's PvE or PvP. Or you might have Rosen at 6 stars already. Now, as for Alpha, I really feel like if you want Alpha, you should probably be pulling on this banner instead of one that is in the future. For the moment, we actually don't know if there's going to be any Alpha banners in the future, but even if there were, I think most people who want Alpha should probably pull her on this banner, and they probably already know why, and that's because Alpha requires Transcender as one of her bond unlocks. So unless you just pull a Transcender and you really don't want to risk pulling more copies of him because you don't want him, this really isn't a bad banner to be pulling for Alpha on because you need Transcender to unlock her anyway. Like I said, there are no alpha banners on the horizon, even on the Chinese server, and for that simple reason I feel like if you want alpha, you should probably just pull for it now. Now if you get a copy of Transcender first instead of alpha, then maybe you can consider holding onto your resources and waiting until alpha gets rerun. But just know you're going to be waiting until at the very least May of 2022 before alpha has a possibility of getting rerun. So now let's take a look at the 3/3Cs that they're adding. So first we have Freya. It is a very good 3C. It's very similar to Christiane's 3C in that it allows Freya to set up in one turn. She can faction buff and guard up in the same turn. It also makes it so that Freya has a faction buff now that gives a special effect, so that synergizes well with units in Origins like Toa. Now even though this is a very good 3C, this doesn't fundamentally change what Freya is, and what she is a pretty good tank without a whole lot of team support. Her biggest team support option is probably just like Mass Protect, which can be very useful against certain enemy AoE users, you know, acid burns and all that. But you know, Freya is still a very passive unit. She doesn't have any offensive presence, and being Holy Class has its downsides because right now Lucretia is running around. She has an attack that's effective against Holy units, and there are a fair number of people that like putting Judge Talisman on their physical DPS. And finally, I think the biggest problem with this 3C is really just a problem with Origins itself, and that's that Origins just isn't a very strong faction right now. They do have a few select very strong units. You know, you have Light of Genesis, who is still very good, Toa, who is still pretty good. Technically, Akka is in Origins, but you know, Akka is usually not used as an on-faction character, but rather as the enabler. Juggler can still be good. King of the Red Moon is pretty good. Leonhard has his 3C now, and he's pretty decent. Tiaras will be better in the future when she gets her 3C, but a faction buff on her is pretty irrelevant, and similar to Akka, she is an enabler. And of course there is SPD Heart way down the line. But whatever the case, that even though this is a very strong 3C, the relevance of it is going to vary greatly with how many Origins units you're actually going to use, which right now probably isn't that many. If Origins get more significant buffs in the future, then you know, this scales up in strength alongside that. But yeah, for that reason, this is probably why you don't see Freya that often, even with this 3C being as good as it is. So next we have Narm's 3C. Just like her entire SP class was, this is more like really overpowered for PvE stuff than it is useful in PvP stuff. Basically having a roundabout with no cooldown. I mean, that's useful in both PvP and PvE, but it's going to be more useful for her in PvE when you want to use her to kite things around. The attack portion of this 3C can pierce guard if you're attacking something with 2 or less movement, which obviously that doesn't synergize that well with Narm's SP talent because she needs to actually hit something before she can reduce its movement. So, you know, you can't pierce guard without having pierced guard already to lower the movement. Obviously, the idea here is that you're probably supposed to use her alongside some low down units like Himiko or even Juggler. You know, that's a lot of extra steps to make Narm a not so impressive assassin when you can just, you know, use an assassin. Again, pretty good 3C for PvE stuff, which is what Narm excels at. For PvP, it makes her like very slightly better, I guess. But she obviously needed a little bit more than this to be relevant. And finally, we have Parn's 3C. Parn's 3C is okay. Like Parn has always been a unit that's more suited to PvE stuff, and this is very good for PvE. You know, it's a 1.7 times damage attack, and it only has a 3-turn cooldown, which is very short for a skill that does that much damage. And if you stacked up Parn enough, this will also have a first strike effect, as well as a dispel 4 buffs effect. Both of these, of course, are very nice effects to have. Again, more useful in PvE, because in PvP, it's like almost impossible for Parn to get stacks in any meaningful way. Because generally speaking, if Parn's close enough to start getting stacks, he's probably already dead. And even in a tank push situation, if you wanted to use Parn to, say, kill Christiane or something, you know, the first strike can cancel out Christiane's first strike, and Parn on Cav class can have an advantage over Christiane, who is often run as infantry. But that's obviously a whole lot of work to make Parn maybe kill Christiane, but there's really no reason to be using him over someone like Elwyn, or, you know, even Leon, or maybe even Helena. It just feels like they intentionally gave Parn a toolset that is not useful at all in PvP, or just very awkward to use in PvP. So yeah, even though it's a pretty decent 3C, Parn's still pretty much around the same place. Pretty good PvE character, but I don't think I'll be seeing him in PvP other than as like a gimmick. Alright, 2 new pieces of equipment, Sage of Trees and Vincent. These are both really good pieces. So for Old Landius, it's obvious that they gave him this helm, a bunch of effects that synergizes very well with a lot of the common equipment that people tend to give him. He has a 3-range normal attack when he wears this, which of course is very nice because People often put Gift of Eternal Life on Old Landius, and this just makes it easier for him to activate it safely. He doesn't have to worry about 2-range counters or counters from enemy mages, unless it's, high-range mages like Light of Genesis or Lucretia. It also lets Old Landius create a plus-sign shaped patch of terrain every time he does a normal attack. I think this is mostly to help Old Landius catch back up to being able to participate in terrain wars, because they added quite a few characters who can just place terrain very, very commonly. For example, both Helena and Licorice can spam their skills or just walk around and create lots of terrain now. And of course, oftentimes they're going to overwrite your terrain as a result. This can sort of help Old Landius catch back up, so you can just attack something and create some terrain again. And of course, Old Landius tiles also allow you to have move again effects for some of your units, so if you use this to attack a certain enemy, you can also create terrain where you can also let your other units pop in and do an attack on them and run away. Whatever the case, this is a very good helm, and even though you're using Teneos Headdress, which of course is always OP, I think this is another helm exclusive they created that has managed to dethrone Teneos Headdress, at least for most situations they're going to be using him. So the other one is Vincent's. So this armor is pretty good. I kind of was a little bit negative about this armor when it first came out, but since then I've played with it myself. I have a 6-star Vincent on my Chinese account, and I do play with him quite often. And of course, people pointed out to me that Vincent's crit rate is actually a lot higher than I thought it was. Vincent uses Detect quite often. You just have to get a decent enchant for crit on his accessory, get some crit stones into him, maybe increase his skill as well. Because usually people don't enchant Vincent for bulk anyway, because he has a revive, so you might as well just go full and attack on him. So the extra critical hit rate is of course nice, but the true prize here is the fact that Vincent can remove 1 buff from people after getting a critical hit. And buff removal is still a very, very strong effect. Shelfnail can still be pretty scary in the right situation, or you just combine it with some Vardar's Rose users, or some units that use the goblins that steal more buffs. It's always a careful balancing act with this sort of thing. But yeah, it's not like Vincent had any particularly powerful chest armors to be equipping. For example, Last Rites wasn't as useful on Vincent because he damages himself as a 3C anyway. And even if you're running Demon Vincent for some reason, there really isn't any particularly outstanding cloth armors that he can wear. So this armor is pretty much taking up like a free slot for the guy. Since his weapon slot is pretty essential, you want Scarlet Reaver there. His helm slot is sort of important, the heal block helm is very useful there. And of course his accessory slot is usually taken by whatever it is you want to kill, usually Judge Talisman. But yeah, if you're a Vincent user, this is his best armor. Be sure to pick it up. So we're about done here, and the last thing I'll mention real quick is that we're actually not getting a whole lot of content this month, and there's really not a whole lot to say about it because even the quote-unquote good treasure this time isn't that useful. It's Mimer's Hammer, or I guess Mimer's War Axe, as it's called on Global. I think most longtime players have a pretty high saturation of this hammer, but yeah, nothing too exciting here, so you don't need to rush yourself getting this time rift cleared unless you really need the currency. You can just sit back and enjoy the story. So that's all I gotta say for now. So again, I know it's been a long time since I made a video or we have said anything. I do apologize for that. Real life has been kind of hectic for me. And of course, I know a lot of people have been asking, oh, where's the info for Gustav, Michelle, and Liza? And if you direct your attention to the left, here's a little preview of something we are about to officially reveal soon. Just a few short clips of us testing out the site. It is legit, almost ready. I'm not joking this time. I really do mean it. We're probably going to have it ready in a week or two. It really is almost ready. So I know it's been a long wait, and thank you everyone for supporting us as you always have. Good luck with your polls or your saving. 2 months from now we are getting Waytam, and I know a lot of people are saving for that. And if you want SB Lana next month, of course you're going to need to spend quite a few crystals getting her. But hopefully in another week or two, you guys will be joining us on this shiny new site that we have built. We have a lot of really great people who worked really long and hard on this site. Even though it's not like something super complicated or anything, we can't wait. We can't wait to show you guys. And I know we're behind on discussing a lot of the Chinese patches as well. Hopefully we can do a bit of catch up in the next couple weeks. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. See you guys next time.